What's going on, you guys? A lot of times when people have figured out that FedEx P&D routes are the right business to buy, they're sort of overwhelmed with how many listings there are and which one they should pick to start to evaluate. And I just want to address a lot of different ideas that people have, misconceptions, questions that they have. And I think once you get through this, it's going to help you out a lot whenever you're thinking about which one of these deals to actually start to look at. So the first thing is that a lot of times people sort of think that if they pick the wrong deal, they're destined to fail. And it's not quite the case. So for example, let's say you were looking at a franchise that's available in your area. You look at the failure rates of that franchise and you say, well, if the number is high, well, it must mean that a lot of people are failing in this business. Maybe it's a bad opportunity. And in the FedEx space, it's not quite the same. And so what happens is a lot of times people are just simply a poor fit for the business model itself, not just a particular set of routes. All of them were a bad choice for them. So a lot of times you got to remember, most people do their research by listening to random people online that don't know what the hell they're talking about. They listen to sellers, they listen to brokers, and they're like, well, I've done my research. Let me buy this thing. And then they realize, oh my gosh, I'm 7 hours away and I really need to be close. And oh my gosh, this thing's taking 20 hours a week and I thought I could do it in 5. And then they realize, oh my gosh, I got to get into a truck and it's stinky and it's dirty and it's noisy and I don't like it. And so they realize that this business is not for them. Now notice, has nothing to do with their expertise, whether they're smart or not, how much money in the bank. None of those things matter. It was just a bad fit in general. So a lot of times when we see these failures, that's the vast majority. Now, the next thing is that even though the majority of routes are inherently good to varying degrees, it's just how much, you will still see some routes out there that are complete junk. They have really almost no intrinsic value. They've got jacked up contracts. The way that they want to sell the business is in these jacked up sorts of ways. There's a lot of things that would make a business completely unsuitable or, in my opinion, not really have any value. The vast majority of routes are not in this sort of category, but I promise you that the routes that are in this category, they're all for sale. And so you do see them, which leads us to our next point, that you really do need to evaluate each deal. Even though we know that for the most part, it's fine, you still need to evaluate it because these other types of routes are still sort of lurking. And secondarily, we still want to make sure that you're getting the right business for you. It's not about picking the right set of routes. It's about looking, hey, is this business right for us? And secondly, are we in the right set of routes to begin with, or is it one of those junk routes? Now, the next thing happens is that they will say, well, I see there's a seller here, and he's only owned it for 2 years. This must be one of those bad routes, the junk routes. And sometimes that's the case, but the vast majority of times that people have only owned their routes for a year or two and they're trying to sell, they were just a poor fit for it. Which leads us to the next thing, which is the idea that all the routes that are for sale on BizQuest or BizBuySell have been passed over by everyone that knows better or has better information than us. So for example, all the contractors have looked at the deal, they say, no, I don't want to touch it, put this thing on the market. A little bit of truth to that, but not quite. So yes, a lot of times contractors have passed over those deals. The better question is, why do they pass it over? Well, there's 3 common reasons why a contractor would pass over a deal that's in their terminal. One is they don't have the money for it because they've already got their own loans. They can't get another loan. They don't have $1 million cash sitting in their bank account, so they can't afford it. Secondly, contractors typically don't pay retail. So a lot of times if, say, for example, the retail market is at a 3x valuation, so the business is selling 3 times an annual net income, a contractor might only pay 2.5, 2, maybe even less than that in terms of the valuation. So contractors don't want to pay that. And then finally, sometimes contractors, even if they did want it, even if they had the money for it, FedEx won't allow them to get over a certain size. You have scale limitations. Now, granted, there are exceptions to that. We're in a little bit of a gray area when it comes to this topic, but sometimes the contractors couldn't get it even if they wanted it. So it leads us to our next thing, which is that there's almost no value in the listing description itself to really be able to understand what it's going to take you specifically in terms of how many hours a week or what it's going to look like for your upside or downside, what your CapEx is, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of things that are unique both to you and also in the terminal that we're not going to see. So a lot of times people will think, well, I'll pick the best one based on the description. And you really can't do that. The only way that you can really get to that sort of point or level of nuance is to actually be in the terminal. Now, in the evaluation process, we're going to start to figure out where those sort of issues may be, where we can start to see whether we're going to need time or money or some sort of energy to be able to solve certain problems and what that might look like. But again, until you're in the terminal, you're not going to know, and I wouldn't worry about it too much at this point. So it leads us to our next thing, which is that all contractors change and have a different definition of what the idea of a good set of routes is. So for example, let's say you were in the corporate world and you said, well, I want to buy some routes and I want to keep my corporate job for a year. And if the routes are legit, which they are, if they're legit, I'm going to quit my job after a year and then I'll go full-time into the FedEx space. So in that case, that person's best route is one that is very high in sustainability and also very high in ease of management. Because remember, we're evaluating all routes in those three pillars: net income, ease of management, and sustainability. So at first, he's going to want something where the net income doesn't matter quite so much anyway. Now, once he quits his job, gets into the terminal, he may say, hey, let's dial down that ease of management because I want my net income to start to go up. So I'm going to be working 40 hours a week in this business as opposed to 10. And maybe I don't even care quite so much about my sustainability. So I'm going to do some things that are a little bit riskier, but it's also going to boost my net income even more. So what one person's idea of a good route is another person's idea of a bad route. And so that leads us to the next thing, which is that how you optimize for whatever you're trying to get to. Let's say, for example, it was sustainability. So you say, okay, what are the rules that I need to follow if I'm looking for a deal that is high in sustainability? So someone online that you don't know says, oh, well, you should be looking at rural routes. Why is it higher sustainability? Well, because it's easier to hire people. Pretty much anyone off the street, doesn't matter whether they hustle or not, they can basically put their foot on the pedal and go out there and deliver everything. And that may be true. So what happens is a lot of times people look for these rules. They say, okay, well, Tony, I'm looking at one that I really want to be high in sustainability. This is a big risk for me. I want to try to mitigate my risk as much as possible. So I want to look for a rural route. Well, not so fast. We have to use frameworks, not rules, to be able to ascertain what's exactly going on in that business. So for example, if you use that rule of getting a rural route is going to be high in sustainability, and then you go and you pick routes in rural West Virginia where your drivers are getting bit every day by dogs that aren't on a leash, your drivers are getting stuck in the snow or the ice or the mud because no one paves their roads and whatnot, like you're going to have service failures left and right. You're going to say, oh my God, this is super low sustainability. This is a terrible idea. Why did I do this? Well, it might have been a great idea in rural Florida, but not so much in West Virginia. So the point is you have to think about each one of these situations for your specific situation in terms of the territory, as well as what your skill sets are and what you're bringing to the table, but also what that terminal is like in general. So you've got to take all those things into account, and I would try to avoid rules and trying to come up with these hard, unalterable ideas about what you're looking for in a particular route. If you see something that seems reasonably interesting, it's worth starting to deeply evaluate it, which leads us to our next thing, which is how big of a size of an operation should we get? Well, most of the time, typical business acquisition experts and whatnot will say, just get as big as you can. Maybe there's some truth to that. I want to show you there's a couple of pros and cons with the smaller side of these deals. So, for example, if you get a smaller operation, you can have a couple of pros to that. One pro is that as you start to grow, you can basically acquire additional routes for a lot less than you would if you were on the retail market. Because remember before, contractors don't pay retail prices. So you're going to be able to grow a lot cheaper than you would if you had just jumped right into it. The other thing that's kind of favorable about being in a small operation is that you're going to get into the terminal, you're going to see where your skills are, you're going to see how long it's taking you, you're going to see which things you like, dislike, and you're going to be able to buy and sell and trade routes with other people and make and essentially carve the operation that you want basically from the start, as opposed to just grabbing someone else's, which maybe they optimize for something else completely, intentionally or not intentionally. And so you don't know what you're going to get if you've already really bought some large operation. You can kind of mitigate that if you start small. The problem is if no one wants to sell their routes and you're stuck in this small operation, sometimes it can take a bunch of your time and it doesn't really give the same sorts of rewards that you would have, obviously, if you got a larger operation. So pros and cons to both sides of it. The last thing is, how close do you need to be to the terminal? Most people, most successful contractors will be somewhere around an hour or less to the terminal. Now, what happens after they've been in it for a year or two? Yeah, sure, they might be a little bit further away. You start to hear stories of people being 4 hours away from the terminal. Yes, did they start out that way? Probably not. Secondarily, you have to remember that even though you can run this thing 4 hours away, and you could buy your first set of routes 4 hours or even further away, you have to remember that just because something is possible doesn't mean that it is probable. And then secondarily, it doesn't mean that it's a good idea. So just because someone has won the lottery doesn't mean that buying lottery tickets is a good idea. And then secondly, you have to remember that the further you are away, the lower your sustainability typically will be. So you can absolutely buy these things far away, but your risk levels are simply going to be higher. Some people are cool with that risk. Some people are not. But just to give you a general idea, most successful contractors start off, they don't end that way, but they start off being an hour away from the terminal. So anyway, hopefully one of these ideas or concepts helps you as you're starting to look through all those listings on BizQuest. Take care, talk soon, and bye-bye.